How do you get an economy that's stuck in a rut moving again? Opinions vary among the world's great economic thinkers. Some tout austerity. As we're learning from Finance Minister Bill Morneau's fiscal update in Parliament, Ottawa's answer is to throw money at the problem. Lots of money. Here are some of the highlights. Infrastructure spending will rise to $186 billion over 12 years. That's up from the $120 billion over 10 years outlined back in the spring budget. A new infrastructure bank will help fund all those projects. It will have a total budget of $35 billion, $20 billion for private sector projects. The deficit for 2016-17 is now expected to be $25.1 billion. At first glance, that might seem lower than the $29.4 billion projected in last spring's budget. It is important to note, though, last spring's number included a $6 billion contingency fund, which has vanished in a weakened economy. In a bid to attract foreign investment, the threshold that triggers a review under the Investment Canada Act now goes up to $1 billion, 2 years ahead of schedule. Now, Morneau made it clear this is a very long-term plan. Here's what he had to say in the House of Commons today.
Decades from now, when my kids tell the story of when their dad was finance minister, I want them to be able to look back and see our government's first year in office as the year Canada began on the path towards a new, modern economy. And we're well on our way.
The opposition, not surprisingly, wasn't convinced. Here's how interim Conservative leader Rona Ambrose reacted.
The reality is that the Liberals are simply out of touch with regular, hardworking Canadians. They claim, again, that growth can be achieved with just one more billion-dollar spending spree.
Here to help us read between the lines of the balance sheet is Craig Alexander, Chief Economist with the Conference Board of Canada. Craig, in reading through this, there was a lot that we had expected, a lot that we were looking for details on. What stood out for you?
Well, the first thing to observe is the fact that the Canadian economy hasn't been delivering the performance that was expected. And private sector forecasters have been lowering their growth forecast for this year, particularly in terms of income growth that impacts tax revenues. And so this has eaten up the government's contingency reserve, the $6 billion that they had put aside in case things were worse than anticipated. Yeah, people might remember that when they initially announced that $6 billion, they were criticized for being overly conservative. Well, it turns out that the prudence factor was necessary. At the same time, the government made a lot of emphasis on long-term investments in terms of infrastructure. And I think that the Canadian economy does need additional investments in infrastructure. I think most Canadians have experienced things like bottlenecks on the highways, and certainly it's costing our economy a lot in terms of creating friction, of not having enough infrastructure capacity. But at the same time, I think that the short-term boost to the economy is going to be limited. I think we will see the infrastructure spending help in 2017, 2018. But really, the big payoff to the economy is down the road in terms of boosting productivity and business competitiveness.
For sure. And I think that line between productivity and this infrastructure spending has been explored. One of the things that came out this week, Luke Cowa over at Bloomberg had a really interesting article about we haven't actually seen a lot of that infrastructure money even begin to roll. Why is it taking so long? And did we hear anything today that might help us get things moving along a little bit?
Well, in point of fact, we shouldn't be surprised that it's taking longer to get the infrastructure money out the door. And it is important to emphasize that when the government says, they're going to spend more money on infrastructure, it isn't when they announce the measure that the money gets spent and has an impact on the economy. These are big projects. It requires engineering, it requires planning, it often requires environmental approvals, and as a result, it takes time for these projects to get underway. And it's only when you break the earth and actually are doing the building of the infrastructure that you get the boon. So I would say in the current year, we're actually not seeing the impact of the government's infrastructure spending. I think that it's starting to show up in the tail end of 2016. I certainly think that in terms of next year's economic growth, we'll see more of an impact. In fact, our forecast says the Canadian economy is going to grow at about 2%. About 0.3% of that is going to come from the infrastructure spending. So it is going to come at a time the Canadian economy otherwise would be delivering weak growth. But really, when you think about the payoffs for these things, it takes a long time for the money to get out the door. It takes a long time for the projects to have an impact, and then for you to get the gains. And the other complication here is, of course, that the government has to choose the right projects to invest the money in terms of infrastructure. There's a lot of projects out there the government could spend the money on that would just be filling holes, but not providing a long-term benefit to the economy. What they need to do is find the projects that would actually help the Canadian economy become more competitive. And that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of the infrastructure announcements is back-end loaded. We're not going to get the real boost to it in the next year or two. It's really farther down the road where you're going to see the payoff. And again, this is all dependent on them getting the right projects.
I used to have a bureau chief in Ottawa who told me that days like this aren't about answering questions. They're about telling you which questions need to be asked next. On that front, I think I was hoping for a little bit more detail on how the Infrastructure Bank was going to work. We got some indication of where the money is going to come from. Did you get many answers about how the Infrastructure Bank will work and what role that will play in getting this money rolling?
Well, we will have to get the full set of details. I understand the basic objective of the government, and to put it into context, the government recognizes that there are inherent limits to how big a deficit it can run. And what that means is that there's a lot of infrastructure projects that the government would like to spend money on but simply can't afford. One way to address that is to try and get the private sector involved in providing more money for infrastructure. And that's what the Infrastructure Bank is really about. The Infrastructure Bank is about helping to encourage Canadian private sector savers like the pension funds to invest in key infrastructure projects in Canada. The government's also trying to get foreigners to look at opportunities to invest in infrastructure in Canada. And the Infrastructure Bank will provide loan guarantees to municipalities and try to reduce the cost of funding the municipalities that are looking to do some capital investments. That's the underlying premise of the Federal Infrastructure Bank. Yeah. But really, the devil's in the details. You need to know exactly how it's going to function and whether the private sector will actually, see the opportunities. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And so their goal is to try and attract investment. The question is, are they going to be able to do it?
Well, nice to have you navigate these details for us. Craig Alexander, thanks for this.
Thanks for having me.